you an I Love Lucy fan, sir? Again, I know that's an older show, but did you watch that?
When I watched I Love Lucy, they were the firsts. They weren't reruns.
You watched the original episode.
I watched many of the original episodes with my family, but that's back in the late 50s.
So when Ricky would come into the house, he would yell something to Lucy when she was in trouble. Lucy, you got some. Do you remember that line, sir?
Splaining to do.
You got some splaining to do. That's what I remember. What about you?
What do you guys remember in the chat? You guys remember?
Bill Knight, this is live, absolutely, sir. For those wondering, this is not pre-recorded. Yes, guys, we are absolutely live.
Unless you're watching this later.
Unless you're watching it on demand, then we may not be live at that time. Maybe you can learn to time travel in the LCS.
What is time? What is linear time?
Next, the phrase "you got some splaining to do" was never spoken in that show, according to any history. You can't find anywhere where there's any clips of Ricky actually saying, "Lucy, you got some splaining to do."
An awful lot of fun, doesn't it?
Yeah. Wait a minute here. There is something here that needs explaining.
What needs explaining?
Lucy, you got some splaining to do.
No, I don't. I've got some singing to do.
Ricky Ricardo. Hey, Lucy. I'm home. Now you got some splaining to do.
Mrs. Ricardo, if you don't mind, I think that I am entitled to a little bit of an explanation of what is going on here!
Oh, Handel, would you excuse us? I have a little explaining to do to Ricky. You sure have, dear. Good night.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people remember. So it's like, how do you misremember like a statement like that, right?
Well, yeah.
Maybe that's a carryover from another comedy that was out just a little later called The Honeymooners, where Jackie Gleason was Ralph Cramden, and I can't remember the other characters, but
maybe he said it in that.
Yeah, so it maybe got confused with a similar kind of comedy.
Well, what is it?
Teach me the mambo.
Oh, sure, it'll be a pleasure.
Yeah?
Well, now, you just watch me and do exactly as I do.
Yes, sir.
Huh? Left.
That's weird, but I can't find any evidence. Like when you type into Google, you got some splaining to do. If it was like the honeymooners, for instance, it would say, "Oh, you're looking for the honeymooners," or "You're looking for." It wasn't Lucy. I personally cannot find any evidence where it's even said in that show, sir.
Oh, even in that show saying it, yeah.
And just the way he said it too, with that Hispanic accent. You got some splaining to do.
And I love remember that. So, moving to the last slide here in this, could our IOUC, the individuated unit of consciousness, or us as individuals within the LCS, have experienced a different history file from the historical database, and therefore it manifests as what we call Mandela Effect in our reality?
I would say no, it's probably not the way it works, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a real effect. I think there's other explanations for it besides that. I thought about it a little because I knew that's what you guys were about, and I kind of found 4 different things that contribute to it. So I don't think it's just a thing. I think there's several things that lead us to this. Now, the first one was just the idea that there isn't, I talked about that reality is only in the mind of the observer. Well, every observer has his own reality because it's his interpretation of the data that he gets. So for one, there is not a reality back then that existed. There is no master reality that exists. It only exists in the minds of the players, and the players all have a somewhat different reality because they interpret the data they get. So there isn't a reality that is kind of the right answer. So that's one thing, so just looking from a perspective of consciousness, there is no the reality that doesn't exist, never has existed. It's a bunch of individual realities. And now we can look at it and see what we, in general, most of us, saw or heard. But so there's that idea that there is no right answer to what it was. We all have our own reality. The next two things, that was the first one. The next two things that came to my mind had to do with the way consciousness perceives. It's attributes of perception. So those are kind of, physical things. And then the last one was basically a paranormal thing. Sometimes the LCS can change things up on us just to get our attention and open our mind. It likes to do that. For instance, crop circles. You have crop circles, and overnight, one night, totally dark, maybe a few lights running around, no sound. And the next morning, you've got 35 acres covered with a very complex design that isn't just straight lines. It's all kinds of curves and things that would probably take a surveying crew of 20 people like 3 weeks to lay it out with their transoms if they were, trying to do it. So the system does things like that just as wake-up calls. Hey, think out of the box. Reality is not just this little thing you think it is. Open your mind. There's more going on here than you're aware of. Well, again, we jump to conclusions and make up the first thing comes to our mind. Oh, aliens did it. The aliens must be doing those things. Well, not necessarily. The larger conscious system triggers lots of people with paranormal experiences just to open their minds. I got triggered to open my mind with an ability to, debug software. Other people, I know a lady who a week after her mother died, she got a phone call from her mother. The phone rang, she picks up the phone, and it's Mom telling her that I'm okay. I just wanted to let you know everything's fine. And of course, she was freaked out. So she took the phone and slammed it down onto the receiver because she thought somebody was messing with her and what a cruel joke it was. And then she realized that wasn't the case at all. She just hung up on her mother who was trying to get in touch with her.
Oda May, listen, I got to talk to you now. I've got a plan. You see, I figured this thing out. There's something we can do. All we got to do is we can... Oda May? Oda May?
Tisha?
Orlando, is that you?
Tisha, where you at? I can't hardly see.
Here, she's here.
In front of you, I'm right here.
Damn, baby, what you do to your hair?
Orlando, you like it? It's autumn sunrise. Get out of me, you son of a bitch!
Don't you ever do that to me again?
Orlando?
Ugh.
So people have these kinds of things. The system goes out of its way to help us see bigger pictures, because only when we see bigger pictures do we start becoming seekers and start learning and growing. And, so the system does that all over. So part of the Mandela effect, that was my fourth one, is that the system often plays these sorts of games just to rattle us a little bit, to get us to open our mind and think out of the box instead of just being stuck in this little materialist groove. And it just does that to individuals, and it does that, like in crop circles, to to whole populations. And it does other things as well. So a lot of the extraterrestrial things that people see, with spaceships landing in their yard and chatting with aliens and so on, all the system has to do to create that is put that data in their data stream. That's it. And then it's there. It's real. They interpret it. And it wakes them up. And after that, they're different people. They start researching. They start wanting to understand things. So that's part of the Mandela effect. And I think the two things that have to do with perception is that we perceive things and remember things in our memory. This is just kind of the fundamentals of the way consciousness works. We work with pattern matching. That's kind of the fundamental way we do things. We work on pattern matching. And what happens is we'll get a new image. We'll go into our data bank to find a pattern that fits it. Now, if we can find an exact fit, oh, great, we'll put that out. But if we can't find an exact fit, we'll pull out anything that even fits a little bit. If it fits, sort of fit, well, we'll pull that out. And that's what it'll be. My wife's name is Pamela. It's not a very common name. And almost every time we go out and meet new people, she'll introduce herself, I'm Pamela Knight. And within a couple of minutes, somebody says, oh, Patricia, what about so-and-so? They call her Patricia. Well, why is that? Because they both start with P and they both end with the Have you ever seen that thing comes around the internet? You got a bunch of words and they have the first two letters are correct, the last two letters are correct, and it's just random gibberish in between, and you can read it. You can read it without any problem because you're pattern matching, and you get a pattern that's close, and that's it. So because that person probably knew a bunch of Patricias, but didn't know any Pamelas or wasn't familiar with it, then the Patricia pattern was firm and strong. So he hears Pamela, he turns it right into Patricia. And if you ask him about it, he'd say, oh, I'm sure you said Patricia, because that's what he heard. That was his interpretation. So we have, our memories are pretty plastic. We can convince ourselves of all sorts of things that aren't true. We have any number of people who were falsely accused of doing things just because it was a faulty memory, particularly if the rememberer is a child. So memory's kind of plastic. We can twist and then believe in the things that we make up, and they become real to us. But mostly it's this pattern matching thing. So let's say another one of those Mandela things that I heard of long ago. Probably the first one I heard was the Berenstain and Berenstain.
Yes, sir.
At the time that they came out, I've got those books. I read them to my children.
This way to bear country. You'll know when you're there. As soon as you enter, you'll feel like a bear. A great grizzly bear. A Berenstain bear. We are the Berenstain Bears.
Mama!
Papa!
Sister! Brother!
We appreciate each other.
I heard it wasn't Stain, it was Steen, like everybody else thought. But I can understand that because at the time, there was a very famous conductor, Leonard Bernstein, and there was other Bernsteins around that were, kind of in the public eye. So everybody had heard Bernstein. That's a pattern. So when you see Bernstein, just like Pamela, you turn it into Patricia. You turn it into something that's more familiar with you. So that's one of the things is the fact that our memory works on pattern matching, right? And we match the best pattern we can, and then our reality is created by our interpretation. So it's our interpretation that this is the way it was. That my wife did say Patricia. Damn it, he heard her. He heard her say Patricia. That becomes our reality. So that's part of it too. So I think you got all these things together. Our mind is our memory is very plastic. We can remember all sorts of things. Another thing that we should think about that's in this thing too is there's a thing called collective consciousness. Collective consciousness is any group of people who have a connection, who feel they have a connection together. They basically form a collective consciousness. So you have a collective consciousness with your where you work, with all the people you work on. If you're an IBMer, then there's a collective consciousness that goes with that. Or if you do childcare, there's a collective consciousness that goes with that. You have a collective consciousness with your nation. You have one with humanity. Carl Jung called these archetypes. They're basically collective consciousness pieces that you identify with and you connect. Well, the collective consciousness is just the vector sum of all the consciousnesses that are in the membership, that are in the group. So you get stuff out of that collective consciousness and you take it on. So, you become more like that. Now you affect the whole, but you only affect the whole a little bit because you're one person and there's maybe 10,000 in your collective. So you don't affect the whole that much, but the whole affects you more. So you work for IBM, and after you've been there 4 or 5 years, guess what? You start wearing blue shirts. You start, you start dressing like they do. You start talking like they do. You start having the same interests that they do, and you become one of them because it's part of the collective consciousness. So if we have a whole bunch of people who were very familiar with Bernstein and weren't all that familiar with a Bernstein, because that's kind of odd, then that becomes part of the collective consciousness. And, people who weren't even born then or never saw the books, they may also get Bernstein out of the collective consciousness, even though they weren't connected. So these are just a bunch of kind of piece parts. And if you take all of those piece parts and put them together, I think you have the Mandela effect. It's a little bit of all of them. It's some stuff. Sometimes the LCS is doing wake-up calls for us, just trying to shake us up a little bit to think out of the box. Other times it's because of our pattern matching. Other times we get it out of the collective consciousness. Collective consciousness creates fads. Why else would 100 people line up at a store at 5 o'clock in the morning to get a Beanie Baby?
I'm looking to get $1,500. If I do make a sale today, one thing I'm definitely gonna do is pay my parents back for the time spent for sitting in line at those drive-thrus.
Collective consciousness makes that connection of all those people, and pretty soon you have to have one. Even though if you were rational, you'd say, well, it's just a little bit of nothing. It isn't much at all. And you're gonna pay, $100 for that Beanie Baby, even though it only costs, $1.50 to make. So that's collective consciousness. So you have that, you have the
brain elasticity, collective consciousness, the LCS, and what was the fourth one, sir?
It's your pattern matching.
And pattern matching.
And the very first thing is it's wrong to assume that there is that there is a master reality someplace. There isn't. There's 8 billion individual realities, and each one of those 8 billion individual realities share some things in common. And then the things they share in common become part of a collective consciousness. So if you take all of those things together, I can see how the Mandela effect is a thing. I can see how that it affects a lot of people differently, because the people that got tricked on this one didn't get tricked on that one, and it's very individual. It's not just that everybody falls in the same boat, because some people never heard of Leonard Bernstein, so Bernstein was just as much of a pattern as the Bernstein, because they never had that. But at that time in the 50s and 60s, when those books came out, that wasn't the case. Bernstein was a famous guy. He was a famous name. And I think there were some other Bernsteins in vaudeville and the entertainment industry as well. So that's a strong pattern. You put it next to a weak pattern, and 20 years later, the weak pattern disappears. Only the strong pattern remains. So that's some of the things that I think come together to make this Mandela effect. And it's all of those. It's not just one of them, but they all work together. So that's my sense of what the Mandela Effect is all about.
I appreciate that in-depth explanation, sir, because you have went a step further than I. Myself, being the theory guy for the Mandela Effect when it first came out, and I started my YouTube channel, I always focused on individuated ideas, and I love the fact you contemplated this to the extent that you've come up with a list of different attributes that could be all working together to create this. Absolutely amazing, sir. I appreciate your work so very much.
Yeah.